I have a dark confession to make to all of you. It was the summer of 2001. I had owned this 1995 Eclipse GS for 3 years. It was my pride and joy back when I bought it, and it was the newest car I'd ever owned. I loved the handling, and the fuel economy was great for such a sporty looking car. That Christmas, my stepfather gave me the Mitsubishi factory service manual as a Christmas gift. After reading through it, a mild case of buyer's remorse set in. All the stuff I wanted to play with it was all in the turbo sections. I wanted to do more involved work with an engine, but I knew I would be limited by only having one car, so I opted to solve both of those problems at once and buy a GSX. I managed to wheel and deal and get one about 2 hours from my house for about half of its Blue Book value and about half of what I paid for the GS 3 years earlier. Well, 5 months later, a 65-year-old guy in a green Chrysler Concorde jumped a curb, hit a fire hydrant, my parked GS, 5 other cars, a row of bushes, and a row of trash cans before driving his car into a lake behind my house. Sad, really. You can see it on the flatbed in the background. I feel sorry for the guy as well as for the GS, but his insurance company ended up buying the car, which really only paid it off. I couldn't do anything to the GSX without having another car to drive, and gas prices were rising, and people were shocked to be paying upwards of $2 a gallon for gas. Oh no! I found this clean 1992 Civic CX hatchback in town for sale and scooped it up for $2,000. The motor was badly worn out and smoked like the space shuttle, but if you fed it 2 quarts of oil per tank of gas, it would still get you around. Since at the time I hadn't yet built a motor of my own, I needed to practice. Jamie found a pile of Honda D15 B7 engines laying in the mud behind the machine shop where he was working as an apprentice and invited me to go scavenger hunting. I had an 8-valve D15 B8 in the Civic CX, and the 16-valve D15 B7 made 34 more horsepower with the same displacement. We took the best half of both engines, and we made one complete motor out of it. In an afternoon, we disassembled both, cleaned the crankcase, ground the valves, polished the crankshaft and cams, honed the bores, decked the head 13 thousandths, and did a one-angle valve job. I had never used any of that equipment before. It was a learning experience like I'd never had. Later, we lapped the valves and assembled the head in his mom's garage. He whipped out these kick-ass pneumatic spring compressors that made the whole job take about an hour. I got to see exactly what it is that makes a Honda tick. Literally. They're solid lifts. That's what the valve train does. We compared the internals from a 1.5-liter Civic and a 1.6-liter Hyundai. I think you can figure out which one is which. Look at the comparison of the 1.5-liter Honda Conrod versus the 1.6-liter Hyundai. They're both forged. They're actually very similar in design, except that you could probably melt down the DSM parts and make 2 Honda connecting rods out of the same Hyundai rod. There's a slight difference between the Honda intake runners and the DSM runners. I mean, it's just a tiny bit of difference there. You can barely see it, right? The valves, left to right. Honda 1.5-liter exhaust and intake. Hyundai 1.6-liter exhaust and intake. I began trying my hands at polishing aluminum. I wet sanded it in my kitchen sink to 800 grit. I began assembling the block in my dining room. Yes, my dining room. Nothing says welcome home like an engine stand next to the dining room table. I painted it with 7 coats of hot rod white engine paint and cleaned up all of my bolt holes with a Dremel. I used to think paint was cool. While my opinion has changed about that, this finish actually held up spectacularly and didn't stain. I took my time. I meticulously masked and painted most of the parts on the engine, but I kept it simple. I started making how-tos for the guys on Honda forums for the things I didn't find VFAQs for. I was a little surprised at how much less information there seemed to be in the Honda forums than in the DSM forums back in the day, so I started making them. I perfected the 15-minute axle swap. The Civic had bad lower ball joints when I bought it, and it cost me $14 a piece to replace them myself. My image host has long since gone extinct, but they were some of the most viewed threads in the do-it-yourself section of HondaAcura.net. Sorry the links are broken now, but this was happening to a lot of DSM links and info, and nothing lasts forever. Before I swapped it, I made a few drag passes with it for a baseline. My first 2 runs were 21 seconds, but I managed to get the clutch to grab once and pull off this 1998. I don't know why it's labeled Jones on the time slip. I acquired a female in my travels, and I got tired of being ridiculed for the dining room engine, so I unbolted the assembled engine, carried it out to the car, and moved forward swapping it even before I had the valve cover finished. The valve cover you see here is actually made of 6 layers of masking tape. I made that to keep the dust out, and we all had a good laugh. It worked out for the best because the chains would have destroyed my hard work polishing. You'll see in a minute. I put the motor in, the axles in, and then started finding all the other things that wouldn't play nice together. The ECU, injectors, air idle control motors, and O2 sensors are different. I had to hunt down a lot of parts and was running a little tight on cash. I found this 87 CRX manifold laying in the dirt at the junkyard, and my cousin helped me fab a $7 straight exhaust tube for it. I couldn't afford the catalytic converter, and the muffler was so clogged we ended up chopping it off and welding straight pipe in its place. I recorded a 0 to 85 mile per hour pull accelerating from a toll booth with this exhaust. Try to contain yourself when you hear it hit ludicrous speed. I installed the stereo that was in my old GS, and I kind of needed it because the exhaust was ridiculously loud. I had beef with a few other things in the interior. Couldn't find out why the second most fuel efficient Civic ever built had a 5-inch fuel gauge, or why would they use such an enormous geriatric coolant temperature gauge instead of a tach. Probably because they didn't want to advertise the fact that the CX only had a 5,000 RPM red line. I managed to house a VX gauge cluster in the junkyard for $12 and surgery began. I documented how to swap out the gel, speedometer, and all that stuff inside it so that you can benefit from having a tach, and correct mileage would be maintained. More VFAX for the Honda guys. I painted the bezel to keep with the engine theme, and even though I knew it was a little ricey, herd mentality got the best of me sometimes. One of my friends with a 3rd Gen Integra totaled his car, and I bought the salvage off him to help him out. I thought I'd try a 1.8 liter DOHC V18B motor, but the cable transmission and wiring left me instead harvesting interior parts like nicer seats and fancier shift knob. It had some stereo equipment in it as well, so I built a rear shelf styled speaker box and amp rack that fit the factory rear shelf mounts and carpeted it to match the interior. Since the CX airbox didn't fit the DX throttle body, I bought a $34 cold air intake off of eBay and called it a day. It was a great fit and it solved my problem. Comparable units with better air filters cost 10 times that at the time, and aside from an occasional bypass valve, none of them really offered anything better than this one did. I finally got the valve cover finished, so once I had all the bugs worked out, there was only one thing left to do: find out what I built. I dragged it up to Extreme Motorsports in Maryland for one of DSMCA's dyno days. It was a great turnout. That Civic actually attracted more attention than many of the cars that showed up because of the number of people gathered around the engine bay at any given time. In a lot full of DSMs, it stood out like a sore thumb. One member canceled his dyno slot, and for $35 I pounced on that opportunity. After a full day of DSM after DSM quietly putting down hundreds of horsepower, I pulled up onto the rollers and everyone that was outside piled in around the dyno jet. It was the loudest car on all of the dyno day. It was launching burning metal from the $7 exhaust because the leaky flux core welds were horrible. Most of the room was holding their ears as I topped 135 miles an hour in 3rd gear. That's right, 135 miles an hour in 3rd gear. I wish I had a video of this. The CX's transmission's final drive ratio, coupled with the DX motor's completely different and wrong torque curve, made this car do some pretty amazing things. 1st gear wound out at 42, 2nd at 82. I have no idea what 4th and 5th would do, but I'm pretty sure it couldn't have overcome the wind resistance to ever find out. After the dyno day, I dropped $300 on a brand new Walker DX exhaust from the manifold to the exhaust tip. It was money well spent. It made the decibel levels tolerable and lowered emissions with a working catalytic converter. I kept it around for about 3 years and put 50,000 miles on it, but I never managed to completely bond with this car despite all the work I put into it. Successfully rebuilding this car was like practice to me, and it gave me confidence to plow through the GSX project with ease. It was purpose-built to get me through that GSX build, which it did very well. I spent lots of time trolling Honda forums while it was all going on, and made some really good friends, but mostly I was just the annoying DSM troll. Once my GSX projects were finished, my focus shifted away from the CX, and I sold it to somebody that would appreciate it more than I would. Gas continued climbing, and I confess that I regret selling it, but the buyer was thrilled with it, and it got taken to a whole new level. 5 years later, and with over 200,000 miles on the clock, and thanks to I-95 southbound traffic, this car has sadly now gone to the great Civic sanctuary in the sky. I'm just glad my friend is okay. It served both of us very well. Rest in peace, little Civic dude. Rest in peace.